Good morning. Michael Spezio is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, and so he brings to his work in neuroscience experience in pastoral ministry and chaplaincy. He's presently assistant professor of psychology and neuroscience at Scripps College in Claremont, California. And he works in the areas of affective and social neuroscience in order to understand human judgment and decision-making in emotion, moral action, and politics. Now, he's, as you might imagine, very well published in the field of social neuroscience, but he's also well published in the area of philosophy and, well, the relationship of philosophy and religion and science as well. And as it indicates in the notes there, he's one of the editors of the forthcoming Routledge Companion to Religion and Science, which he says he hopes will be out in September this year. And he's been extremely busy as well as working on that. He's been working on another publication by Routledge, Virtue, Theology and Neuroscience, which should be out in December, which as somebody who also teaches in ethics, I'll be certainly looking forward to seeing that. And so we've got somebody with a considerable breadth of experience today speaking to us, I think, on a very important topic, something that is simply going to be huge as time develops. And so we have this morning Michael Spezio speaking to us on neuroscience and pastoral ministry, lessons from the study of emotions, contemplative practice, and moral action. Let's welcome him as he comes to speak to us.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning. It's a real joy for me to be here and to look out on the hearty souls that are here bright and early, 8:30 a.m. And what I'm going to hope to do is to bring you some perspectives that come out of my journey, my wish to understand how neuroscience might apply when I approach people as pastor and in activities in hospital chaplaincy or in the congregation. And I'd be interested in talking with you afterwards if you have follow-up questions to learn from your perspective as well. I wanted to start just by quickly acknowledging the fact that I'm not doing this work alone. I'm part of a collaborative team that involves, for contemplative practice, involves Andy Dreitzer and Frank Rogers at the Claremont School of Theology. They're at the Center for Engaged Compassion, and would like to acknowledge gratefully support from the Fetzer Institute and the Mind and Life Institute too. And I'll be talking a little bit about this research as part of my talk on this neuroimaging research on centering prayer, a Christian contemplative practice that I hope will fit in with the theme this morning, and I hope I've worked it in well. And then this team here, and of course everyone will recognize Warren Brown and Kevin Reimer and Greg Peterson, James Van Slyke, Linda Zagzebski, who's a philosopher of religion and a virtue theorist, and Kristen Monroe, who's the head of the Center for the Scientific Study of Ethics at UC Irvine, all collaborators on this project, the Habitus Project, Humane Archetypes Biology, Intersubjectivity, and transcendence in virtue science. And I'll be presenting a little bit of our work together there as well, where we've done some neuroimaging to ask about whether character, that is stable character for the good, can be demonstrated. And I'll touch on that. And we've had very nice and generous funding from CTNS in the form of their Science and Transcendence Advanced Research series. So let me begin by trying to find a point of contact by picking up where Jeff Schloss really left us quite eloquently at last night's talk. We're going to focus on these questions to begin. What is constitutive of being human? What is the end of humanity? This is where I begin in my own approach to the science here, and I think it relates to the 2 points that Jeff raised near the end of his talk about human uniqueness and about the Christian understanding of God as sacrificial love. And so where can we begin? We try to look for some points of engagement between pastoral ministry, theology, religion, and the sciences. And so what we're going to look at here is that the end of human becoming is a formation of the human person in community for the love and the service of others. This is where I think that social neuroscience engages very strongly with pastoral understandings of the person. Pastors are trained to be leaders in this kind of spiritual formation of the congregation that they lead, or the people they care for in the hospital, in the prison, in the street. And this is, I think, where we can begin. So Aquinas actually identified love as the first movement of the will. Love of the other, of God or one's sisters and brothers, for their own sake and not for one's own selfish gain. And Aquinas, thanks to Servet-Pinker, Aquinas, we understand, says, without love, no other virtue can really be alive. And such love in Aquinas requires misericordia, which is often translated as mercy, but is probably better understood, especially if we're going to engage in contemporary discussions within social neuroscience, focusing on compassion, etc., as loving kindness. The Hebrew chesed. Aquinas quotes Augustine, loving kindness is, in Augustine, heartfelt sympathy for another's distress, impelling us to succor him if we can. And this is the kind of place that I think we can really find points of engagement, and I'll suggest why. So we're dealing here with the relational imago Dei, which is one of the 4 primary understandings of the image of God in human beings. This is, I want to stress, it's not a capacitative view. It's really a constitutive view. That is, that the image of God in human beings is that relationality constitutes human beings. Humans are not possible absent relation. And every pastor or leader in the church sitting here understands this very deeply, that without connection with a faith community, in a faith community, formation for what our end really is very difficult indeed. And so it's this constitutiveness by relationality that I want to lift up here. Not to say that the other ways of understanding the image of God are not legitimate or not valid, but I'm lifting this up right here for the purpose of the talk. And then finally, this leads us to ask, how does such sympathy and such will to provide comfort arise in the embodied person in community? And so for this, we might actually turn to social neuroscience, not for some authoritative answer, but for some clues about embodied influences that lead us this way. So social neuroscience, what is social neuroscience? It's an interdisciplinary field joining cognitive neuroscience and social psychology. It's trying to understand how humans and the human brain might be understood as formed by sociality. Social neuroscience really does take the social constitution of the human very seriously. By analogy with cognitive neuroscience, social neuroscience seeks to understand how the brain contributes to the emergence of persons in community. The contribution of the brain must be understood, though, within a framework of mind. And so social neuroscience focuses on the processes of shared understanding and often misunderstanding between people, and complex social choices such as those in political and moral decision-making in virtue. I want to make it very clear that one of the misunderstandings of neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, social neuroscience, affective neuroscience, is that the aim is to understand the brain. That's absolutely 100% false. The aim is to understand the human person and the human mind. And the cognitive comes first, cognitive neuroscience. The social comes first, social neuroscience. It's not to try and understand the brain as if it were in some vat, disembodied. That's something that too often comes across, that neuroscience is only really seeking understanding of the brain. And so we try to concern ourselves in social neuroscience with human uniqueness within a larger connection, of course, to non-human nature because of the embodied connection that we have with non-human nature. So one of the things I'd like to start with is the social brain hypothesis. What you can see here is a chimpanzee skull, a human skull, and you can see that the skulls are relatively the same size, but the brains are not. And one of the main questions in human evolution is to try and understand why do we have brains that are so darn large, even though we know that having brains so large creates serious problems, especially in childbirth and metabolically as well. So the human brain is about, in an adult human, is about 1.4 kilograms, and in a chimpanzee, it's about a kilogram less. So that's a big difference. And the question is, you know, why is the human brain so large? What's going on? Why does it take so much energy? And how is it that this thing that weighs not very much in terms of our body size consumes up to 20% of our energy every single day? It seems like it's a puzzle that we have to understand through evolution. And so giving birth is very difficult and often dangerous, as it was in ancestral times in the past. And the brain size and organization, according to the social brain hypothesis, to answer these questions, is due to social organization. Social brain hypothesis says that we have the kinds of brains that we do because of the social constitutive nature of being human and our social bonding. So this is work, I want to just show a couple of data slides, not my work, but work by Robin Dunbar and colleagues. And this is looking across order, and what you have here, here is the actual encephalization slope, or how large the brain is relative to the body. And here you have the stable social groups. And you can see that as you move up orders here, so here are primates, and here are cetaceans, you basically have a rough proportional increase, so that as you go up encephalization slope, or larger brain to body ratio, you go up also in stable social groups. Well, what about within primates? Looking at stable group size, this is the neocortex ratio, the neocortex being the most recently evolved part of our brains. And this is the mean group size. And what you have here is shown a plot for monkeys, so different monkey species, and for the great apes. And there are not as many great ape species, of course. And what you have is a rough correspondence, again, between as neocortex ratio is going up, so is the mean group size. And so you have an underlying relationship between sociality and brain size. This contributes to support to the notion that we have the kinds of brains, and primates in general have the kinds of brains they do, largely because of the needs of social organization and social work together. Now, is this social organization competitive? Partly, but often there are affiliative behaviors. And this is, again, Robin Dunbar's recent work. This is from a paper in 2010, just to show you some behaviors called grooming behaviors. So here you have, and that cat looks like a very happy cat. And so you have this looking at, oops, there we are. Looking at group size, you have, as group size increases, you also have the time spent grooming. So it's not as if group size requires some kind of larger brain because of a Machiavellian or solely Machiavellian need to outthink and outcompete and manipulate the other. But there is also evidence for clear affiliative behavior, like this kind of grooming. And so this is the kind of emphasis that I'd like to pick up on in the rest of the talk. So if we can just briefly turn to the first fruits of engagement, we would say that the social brain hypothesis, social neurosciences, we have the kind of brains we have due in large part to our social being. We are constituted within and by community. This is a critical point, I think, in understanding spiritual formation, and one which everyone here knows very well. And I want to point out, I've just completed a group second reading of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Life Together, which I highly recommend to anyone if you haven't already read it. And Bonhoeffer's themes fit very well with spiritual formation in community, in a faith community. And he warns us not to idealize that community, and I'll try not to do that for the rest of my talk either. So now let's turn to these questions here. How does the science as science proceed, and how can this help us in understanding the human and within work in pastoral ministry? What are the methods? Can we affirm methodological reductionism without at the same time affirming ontological reductive materialism, as was the problems of which were made very clear in the fine lecture yesterday afternoon? So what we want to look at here is our inquiry, and we start with multi-level approach. And this is something that Kevin Seybold mentioned yesterday, and I'll just spell it out a little bit more what I'm talking about. We have a first-person perspective, which is a narrative of meanings that are most clear to myself, yourself, where you're actually coming from, your perspective. We also have, and even though these are formed with others, it's sometimes difficult to communicate completely what you might mean in some deep sense from the first-person perspective. That's probably best accomplished when you're in second-person relationship, that is close I-thou relationship with others, through a narrative of meanings that are clearly understood between you and your close loved ones. This is the second person, the often missed and often sort of ignored second person in the close meeting of two or more persons. Again, this is really very close to the meanings in life together. And then finally, there's the third person, which is a narrative of meanings that are most closely clearly understood when we bracket. And by bracketing, we don't mean doing away with the importance of, but simply bracketing for a time, close relationship with the other in relation, or close relationship with one's own first-person perspective. These are least dependent on close relation and most accessible via abstractions. And of course, this is where we're going to be doing most of our exploration here, but I think there will be bridges between this perspective and the other two. Okay, so let me turn to now the methods that we actually engage in cognitive neuroscience, which are the same methods that are taken up by social neuroscience and affective neuroscience, decision neuroscience, etc. The goal, as I said just a moment ago, is not really to understand the brain. It's to understand the mind. And we really want to form formal models of the mind using both conceptual logical models and information processing models, and sometimes, whenever possible, introducing and making use of computational models. And so what kind of information do we as scientists, because the mind is invisible, we can't measure the mind directly, so we need to actually go through operationalizations of the mind. And you know, just to convince you that I kind of know what I'm talking about with regard to the cognitive neuroscience being about the mind and not the brain. Cognitive neuroscience takes up themes within experimental psychology, which Noam Chomsky said back in the 1950s. He said psychology is the science of the brain, or sorry, the science of behavior. Psychology is the science of behavior, like physics is the science of reading meters. It's really that simple. Psychology, experimental psychology, is not the science of behavior. It's the science of the mind. And cognitive neuroscience takes that up, and in addition to looking at behavior as a way of trying to constrain our models about the mind, it then brings in the brain and what we call neurometric approaches, in addition to our psychometric approaches here, and the relationship between these. And it loops back and forth between the models and the data, and the models and the data, and it brings to account both the neurometric and the psychometric data in order to better understand and better form these models. So that's what we're doing in social neuroscience, taken up from cognitive neuroscience. Relatively young field, sort of started in 1981 in the backseat of a taxi. I could tell you the story, but it's probably, yeah, anyway. So now, because we're dealing with the science, we really need to face our embodiment. And I want to share a quick narrative with you that points up the stark reality of our embodiment. And it's something that I don't think, as pastors, any one of us, ministers, any one of us wants to shy away from, but rather to face. And by face, I mean when we face someone or something, we really then take that person in, or that phenomenon in all of its stark reality. So let me share this narrative, which comes from a 1999 publication about a patient with Parkinson's disease. So this is a patient who was she was a 65-year-old woman with a 50-year history of Parkinson's disease. A 30-year history, forgive me. She had no history of psychiatric disorders, no depression, nothing, no mood swings, no other disorders, just Parkinson's. She had to undergo some intracranial surgery, so brain surgery, to implant electrodes in so that her symptoms could be reduced via electrical stimulation, her Parkinson's symptoms. And we're going to look primarily at a particular contact in the substantia nigra. And I'm just going to show you a picture of the brain. Here's the front of the brain, back of the brain. And we're going to take a slice right here, and we're going to slice it like this, and then we'll turn it out so that you can see the brain area. Not sure how visible this is to you, but the substantia nigra is right in there, and there is our person that whose narrative we're exploring today. She's very courageous, as you'll see in just a moment. So she had this surgery, and once the electrodes were implanted, they turned the electricity on, and something extraordinary happened to this woman. So after the electrodes were on for just a couple of seconds, she started to display these facial expressions and verbal expressions and emotions suggesting terrible depression. Here is the comment of her physician. Although still alert, the patient leaned to the right, started to cry, and verbally communicated feelings of sadness, guilt, uselessness and hopelessness. Now, this is a woman who's never had any symptoms like this in her life. And now there's a flip of a switch, and there's electricity coursing through a part of her brain, and she's not only displaying this, she's actually reporting this as her first-person experience. Very scary. I can just imagine. This is her. She's talking. She says, "I'm falling down in my head. I no longer wish to live, to see anything, hear anything, feel anything." So she is in a point of despair within about 90 seconds of turning this electricity on. "I'm fed up with this life. I've had enough. I'm disgusted with life." So this is all quotes from the patient. "Everything is useless, always feeling worthless. I'm scared in this world." This is devastating. It's absolutely terrible. Her physician goes on to say she had no hallucinations, nor were there any changes in her motor or cognitive symptoms of Parkinson's disease. It was just this terrible despair that she felt and reported and expressed. And this is her after about 4 minutes of this stimulation. It's really tough to think about. Well, this patient is quite courageous. Here she is after the stimulation is turned off. She became very playful after the stimulation was turned off. Her mood bounced right back. She started pulling on the physician's tie very playfully, and all of the symptoms that had just gone on, a couple of, not even half a minute earlier, all completely alleviated once the switch was off. So this is a stark facing of our embodiment and our embodied reality. And the interesting thing is that this patient was so courageous that she underwent this experience several more times so that they could actually do neuroimaging and find out where in the brain the activation was. And where is the activation? Well, a large part of the activation is here in the amygdala and extending down into the orbitofrontal cortex. Again, here's the front of the brain, the back of the brain. This is called a glass brain because it's kind of a transparent brain. And you can see it's in the left amygdala. So left is on the left and right is on the right. So the left amygdala and into the orbitofrontal cortex. And these are areas, as we'll see fairly shortly, that are very much involved in our own emotional experience of the world and in understanding the emotions of others. So our own emotional processes provide us information to understand and to connect with other people. And I'll touch about this. This is the kind of quote-unquote mirror neuron or simulation theoretic approach that we heard about briefly yesterday. The point, though, is that the significance of all of this is only established because of her first-person experience. Were she completely unable to communicate, to relate, and were she completely out of relationality with her physicians, with her family, etc., none of this might really matter. And so I want to emphasize that even in the radical embodiment that is, and I want to shy away from the term physicality. I don't think embodiment and physicality are the same thing, and I don't have time to go into why. But I want to say that even though we have here an example of our radical embodiment, flipping a switch and making us feel things that we've never felt before in our lives, and turning the switch off and then those feelings just disappear. None of that would matter if it weren't for her ability to communicate that in a narrative that she is able to help us understand. So now I'd like to turn to the question of how hardwired we are for this connection. How hardwired human beings are for this kind of social connection, and what is the relevance of mirror neuron or better understood simulation theory for pastoral ministry. I want to emphasize no one has yet documented a mirror neuron in humans. It's never been documented, even though it's been looked for. There have been attempts that have come close. Yitzhak Fried's group in UCLA, but no one has yet done intracranial recording to document a mirror neuron. Mirror neurons come primarily, of course, as we heard yesterday, from work with monkeys. And the question is, are mirror neurons or simulation theory? So, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. Does that get us all the way to full social understanding and the kind of love and willing to comfort those who are suffering? That's something that we need to ask if we're to understand the relevance of social neuroscience for our pastoral ministry. So I want to say, well, we're hardwired to do some things, at least if we develop within community, we are. And hardwired can mean different things. Sometimes it simply means we've learned things over the course of development. So what I'd like to do is to play two videos for you. These videos are just bunches of lights that seem to move together. The striking thing about them is that immediately as they start moving, you'll start having some impressions. And I want you to see what those impressions, what impressions come to you. So let's take a look at this video here. Hope that this is coming through. I don't know if there's a way to dim the lights, but it's probably better not to given the early hour. So here we go, first video. Okay, so one could ask what kind of emotion that person was displaying. So let's take a look at this second video. These are point light walkers. And so what's striking, if my mind is working similarly to yours, is that you immediately perceive a three-dimensional object. There is no three-dimensional object there. It's simple lights, so you immediately have this sense that there is a three-dimensional person there walking, even though there are just lights, and you immediately have an impression that this person is kind of relaxed and calm, and this person might be a little bit in a hurry and kind of agitated. And that takes no effort whatsoever, but people who are very high functioning otherwise, but who have autism, find it very difficult to understand this. People who lack amygdalas, so they have both of their amygdalas in the brain gone, they have difficulty understanding these kinds of stimuli. Let me show another more impoverished stimulus. This is a video from Hyder and Simmel, work done way back in the 40s. And just take a look at this and see if anything pops out and strikes you as interesting. Oh, that guy was pretty mad. So you can probably sense that you might have, if I'm like you, you might have started seeing this in terms of the little triangle being afraid of the big triangle, and the little circle trying to help the little triangle, and that's crazy, right? I mean, these are just shapes running around a screen. But in fact, these stimuli, and stimuli like these, are currently used in social neuroscience to diagnose problems of social inference, that is, understanding social interaction in people with autism or people who were born without a corpus callosum, etc. This is an example of an extremely impoverished stimulus, and if a person lacks both amygdala, again, they look at this and they say, well, there was a triangle, and the triangle moved, and it kind of went back and forth, and then it kind of bumped into another triangle. There's no actual social interpretation, social inference here at all. But for most of us, it's very easy to do that. In fact, it's hard to view this without doing that. So the question of how hardwired or how natural it is for us to see these kinds of things in social, it gives some insight into how readily we actually see the world this way and see and think about agents interacting. Okay, so this gives us some idea. So now the question is, what about simulation theory? Simulation theory provides us with a mechanism by which we can understand others. Is this mechanism enough to be able to explain all of that's necessary for the kind of love and social understanding that Aquinas talked about, that we talk about within our tradition? This is work by Valeria Gazzola and Christian Keysers, both working at the Netherlands Institute of Neuroscience. And I want to show you a video. I apologize to those of you here, probably nobody here, but if you have a phobia of spiders, you can look away. So here's a video of a Bond film, and as that spider crawls up Bond's arm, some of you might actually be having that sensation yourself, kind of a little bit on your own arm. And that's the kind of thing that we're talking about with simulation theory. So most of us would look at this and we would immediately say, oh, well, that's, you know, he's trying to avoid getting bit. He's trying to get away, but he can't. And people who have difficulty with those kinds of social inferences would maybe look down here and they would say, boy, that's an interesting pixel. It's moving back and forth of different colors. And they would completely ignore what's going on here. So, but for most of us, it's very simple. And simulation theory simply is that, that most of our understanding of the other, the intentions, the emotions, the actions of other people come via the same circuits that we use, or at least largely overlapping neural circuits that we use, and mental processes that we use to actually experience, intend, and act ourselves. Okay, so let me show you some examples of experiments like this. So if you would ask, does this person like or fancy this drink, you would say, well, that person reached for the drink, so probably yes. And this is a kind of stimulus that's used in this research at the same time as a person is in the scanner and they are reaching themselves for some kind of spoon or something to eat or drink in the scanner. So you have performance and you have observation, and you ask, how much do these overlap in brain activation? And that is the essence of simulation theory. That's about action. You can also have it about emotion or valuing. So does this person, and then you have the overlap in the brain between observation and performance. So you can ask about whether the person likes the drink. And so I'll ask you to judge, and oh, not at all. No, it's very bad. So these are very bad smells, smells like rancid butter. And you know, Christian, he's not a bad guy, but he does make people in the MRI scanner smell things like that. And they look at this person and they actually then smell the smells themselves, and then you ask about the overlap between observation and experience, and you get brain areas to overlap. And simulation theory then claims that these are implicit, that is, we're not really aware of making these inferences, or how they come about, but they are implicit judgments, and these work even when we have robots. So Christian has done this with, if you subtract the motion from a still picture, you get all of these areas overlap. Well, what about a robotic arm? A robot doesn't have any intention, any emotion, at least that we know. And if you actually use a robotic arm, look at that, you get the same kind of pattern. If you actually take the human and you subtract the robotic arm here, you basically wind up with very little difference. So we're so clearly disposed to making these kinds of mental inferences dependent, at least in part, on some of these neural areas of shared circuits, that it's quite remarkable. And here's another nice experiment, really now looking at simulation theory and perspective taking, really actually taking the perspective of another person. So participants were asked to both perform and to listen. Now this isn't visual, this is simply listening to, and I don't think you'll be able to hear it, but I'll have to ask you to trust me on this. The first sound that they were asked to listen to was basically a hand action opening a can of soda. Then the second sound was a mouth action, basically gargling with a big spit at the end. It's fun doing these experiments. And then the other one is just an environmental, non-intentional action of just a faucet dripping. And what was looked for were shared brain areas for both performance of these, so people had hand actions to perform. For mouth action, they actually took some large marbles and rolled them around in their mouth, and they looked for hand, mouth, and both, and that's shown here in these different colors. And you can see that the overlap. Now, that's basically just what I've been showing you, but what's very interesting is we have these psychometric or self-report assessments that ask how much is it that you take another person's perspective, and we don't ask it that directly, but indirectly we can get at that. And then the question is, how much does a person's own self-report about how much another person's perspective matters to them, how much does that self-report overlap with their brain activation? And here is the data shown for all 16 subjects. And if you actually go ahead and separate this out on perspective-taking scores, so this is again the overlap due to, or that would presumably go along with simulation theory. Here we have perspective-taking scores. So these people are really high in saying, yes, I value another person's perspective. These people are low. If we take a look at the high, we actually have quite a bit of activation here in simulation theoretic networks, more than here, interestingly enough. If we take those who are low, you kind of have a silent brain. There's very little going on in the kind of simulation theoretic networks. And so the question is that can we associate what's going on in the brain with what's going on in a person's first-person report about what's important? And the answer is yes, there are these associations. They're far from perfect. They're absolutely not far from perfect, but sometimes they're quite dramatic. This goes along with both the function of the amygdala in our emotional experience of fear and in our understanding of another person's fear. So what's plotted here is activation in the amygdala and the intensity, and you have very high intensity shown here and low intensity shown here, and this is activation over time. So this is the amount of activation in that brain area, the amygdala, over time during the experiment. And sure enough, a person who says, oh, when I'm imagining that really makes me afraid, shows larger activation in the amygdala, not so afraid, not so much. And a person who lacks amygdala completely, as this person's face changes from happy over to fear and kind of morphs from happy to fear, that person's correlation of judgment of what this person is feeling. So this is the lesion subject judging. What is that person feeling? What is that person? What is that person? And then finally, what is that person feeling? Their correlation with norms falls off dramatically. They can't tell that this person is showing fear. They don't understand that. There's a lack of information, probably because of the lack of the shared circuit functionality. All right. So basically, I'm going to go ahead and skip a few slides. That's kind of the picture of the Phineas Gage constructed from his skull, quite dramatic. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at whether simulation theory is strong enough or enough to account fully for the kind of social ends that we think about in terms of the human. So is it enough? Well, yes, there is enough social connection in terms of you know, the constitutive nature of our social being. Yes, we have connections in terms of being predisposed to simulate and understand the actions of others. But crucially, some experiments in simulation theory more recently are showing that there is a strong tendency to project one's own desires, one's own intentions on the other. And this is a problem because this simulation activation then is stronger when we observe those with whom we feel affinity already. So it's kind of simulation is gated by our own felt affinity with the other, and it's modulated by our own emotional states. So simulation really does not equal the heartfelt sympathy with a will to comfort and aid the other, though it might be attuned via ethical and spiritual formation, and I'll turn to that here. But here's some evidence, though. This is a paper that came out in 2007 showing that if you're watching someone grasp food, just like we did before, if you're hungry, you have more simulation activation. So that means that you're really like, I want that food, and I want to be grasping that food and get away from my food. And so, you know, that would not be expected if simulation were really free of our own biases, our own projections, etc. Also, and very interestingly, this is a recent paper showing that people with alexithymia, so people who are terrible at understanding their own emotional states and at understanding the emotional states and intentions of others, they show greater simulation theoretic activation when observing others, which is very paradoxical, except that basically that is due to their projection on the other. We also, I've done a study with Christian and Valeria where we studied kind of a sensual caress by, you know, and this was basically sensual caress of men who are heterosexual by both a woman and by a man. And it's very clear that there is greater activation in the hand area. The caress was to the leg and only to the lower leg. There was greater activation in the hand area when the woman was caressing than when the man was caressing, which we're interpreting. It doesn't make sense except if you interpret that the men were not so into having the man caress them sensually on their lower leg, but they did actually perhaps, at least some of them, wanted the woman to kind of do that some more. All right, so where are we with simulation so far? Emotion and action simulation can yield information. We also now understand that such simulation can be vulnerable to one's own projection about the other, then missing true other regard and falling far short of the kind of love of the other. And so it would seem that we are not as hardwired for empathy as some popular accounts might have it. We seem to be in need of real formation. This is not going to come as a surprise to any of you. I'm just saying that this is an area in which pastoral ministry can actually, say that, well, we were kind of ahead of the science, and to develop as persons in community, persons who can mind the other effectively without projection of our own wishes, etc., onto the person's intentions, emotions, and actions. So what about emotion as information? This is very clear from social neuroscience, that in order to understand whether or not our actions are harming or benefiting another person, we absolutely need to mind the other, and we cannot shut off our emotions from reasoned decision-making and engagement of that other. And this is important, in my view, for pastoral care in the congregation and in the hospital. So when we're talking about minding the other, we're basically talking about imaginatively reconstructing the understanding, the preferences, the choices, the feelings, desires, expectations of another person. We're respecting these aspects of a person, is what is meant in bioethics by respecting autonomy. So this is important, especially for critical decisions in the context of a hospital. This is more than just respecting a person's right to make their own decision, but it's respecting them fully as a person. So here I want to emphasize that in the event that a patient cannot directly act or speak for himself or herself, every attempt must be made to reconstruct his or her particular perspective and then to represent it with as much accuracy and fidelity as possible. And this means narrative, deep, rich, thick engagement. This is the kind of engagement that pastoral care is all about, narrative approaches. This is actually supported by the implications of the findings I've just discussed. So then we come to the question of, well, how can we understand what might be going on in embodied processes as we try to go beyond the simulation theoretic networks, which are fallible due to our own tendencies to project? How can we understand spiritual formation? I want to talk a little bit, just shortly, about centering prayer and Christian contemplative practice. And why study centering prayer? Well, centering prayer, it's not the only prayer, of course, that one should study, but I've chosen it because it's explicitly an I-thou relational practice. And it seeks, I think, to foster the kind of life that we talked about, Aquinas mentioning and Augustine mentioning at the beginning, and of course in Better Together by the same author as Bowling Alone, whom we heard about yesterday. We hypothesize that some of the effects of centering prayer, therefore, would be social, would be transformative and formative in developing these dispositional capacities to increase compassion, trust, and positive relations. All right, so this is kind of a description of centering prayer in the words of our own participants. Some of you may know about this. I'm not going to go through it, but if you have questions about it, I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards. So when I notice or realize that I am following my own thoughts rather than being open to God, I think of my symbol to clear away my own thoughts. There's no magic here. Centering prayer does not magically connect us to God. What it does is it attempts to ease us of the distractions that get in the way of recognizing the presence of God, the presence of Christ always to us. So what we did is we worked with 10 participants. We asked them during fMRI scanning to undergo centering prayer, and then just to do centering prayer just prior to making trust decisions. So we're asking, does centering prayer affect social judgments immediately afterwards? And we also had an active control. This is really important. In the same people, we had an active control of listening intently to an auditory narrative. Happened to be kind of a dry, boring, sorry for those of you who really like this, dry, boring narrative. It was Voyage of the Beagle. Sometimes people suspect that I really want to see what happens to Christians when you force them to listen to Darwin in a scanner, but that's not at all true. So what happened, what we observed was, and the question is centering prayer really any different than just simple attending, simple attention? And what we observed was that in simple attention and active listening, you have a bilateral activation. Again, this is with eyes closed, just like centering prayer, a bilateral activation in the parietal cortex, and a bilateral activation in prefrontal cortex along the midline. In centering prayer, by contrast, and this is in exactly the same group, you have a right lateralized activation in the parietal cortex, slightly further and you also have a right lateralized extensive activation in prefrontal cortex. And then when we asked what happens immediately after centering prayer to social judgments, so they were asked to make trustworthiness judgments about people, what we saw was activation following centering prayer, a stronger activation in the amygdala, which has previously been shown by many studies to be involved in trustworthiness judgments. So this activation was actually stronger after centering prayer than active listening. We see a right lateralized, again, in the parietal cortex, and right lateralized in prefrontal. And if we take a look at what we saw during centering prayer, now importantly, this is not during centering prayer, but actually during a social task, we actually see that there is some overlap in the voxels activated. And this suggests then that centering prayer has some effect, at least in the immediate future, on social networks. And so what we're saying is that the making of these dispositions is really incomplete, and we need to actually go through formation. So the dispositions and capacities could be developed in practices of Christian spiritual formation, and we have some evidence, and we're not the only ones working on this. Others are also. Practices, therefore, of Christian spiritual formation, such as centering prayer, not only show patterns of brain activation that differ from simple attention, which was an open question, at least in the minds of skeptics, but there are also immediate changes to networks involved in social understanding and action. And then finally, let me go ahead and conclude by talking a little bit about Christian formation and character. Is there any evidence that we can have stable, loving character? And this is work that is done in the context of the Habitus Project, which is very much an exemplar, virtue theoretically based project, but fits, I think, hopefully and helpfully with pastoral ministry in talking about character formation and the importance of spiritual practice and regular attending to the sacred narrative for spiritual formation, character formation. So let me just say, there's a lot of doubt in social psychology that character is anything real, that basically character is a fiction. And so this work is designed to try and get at that a little bit more. So what we have here in trying to identify whether or not we can at least try to putatively, at least initially, identify different types of character in the laboratory is we have groups of individuals, and we have a group of about 200 people total, but they're going through groups, and there are 15 rounds on which they have to make decisions. On each round, they get $10, and if they choose to place it in the pot, and enough people choose to place it in the pot, then everybody gets a bonus $10. And basically everybody winds up with 20. But if you kept your money and enough other people, the suckers, I mean that's what economists call them, the suckers, if they gave enough, then you get more money because you kept yours and other people sort of contributed to the public good, and that benefited you. So the outcomes, if you give, you can get $0, basically giving it all away if not enough people give, or 20. If you keep, well, you keep your $10, or you can get $30 because you get the $20 bonus. So we want to pick those people who give most often to try and test them as putative exemplars for stability of character in other contexts. We've identified this group. You can see that most of our people never gave at all. They just kind of sat there, and yeah, we worked with a great group. And these are the people that we focus on. And it turns out that if there's a portrait value scale, I'd be happy to share more details if you're interested, developed by Shalom Schwartz, who's a social psychologist, very interesting social psychologist in Israel. Developed this portrait value scale, is now part of the European Social Survey, in fact. And it turns out that people who give in this area and definitely give well above their own group level to the point where it's costing them, it's really costing them money, they actually report higher levels of valuing benevolence, which is loving kindness defined by Schwartz, and spirituality. Very interesting. None of the other values actually come out as significant. So then we invented, and I won't go through the rescuer paradigm here, but we invented this paradigm to ask, if you're an observer, and we take some of these putative exemplars, and we ask them to observe an interaction that's very strange and perhaps off-putting, where you have a person who's a real person being repeatedly victimized, that is, having money stolen from them. Will you sit there and do nothing, or will you help over repeated rounds? So this is what there's no display of any person or any facial expression. This is all that our participants see. So you have round 1 of 15, you have $300 left, and the victim has $150 left. The perpetrator has stolen $25 from the victim. What do you want to do? You can keep your own money because it's their own money, and I want to stress, if they sit there for the entire time, we do this for 3 sessions, they can take home $90 in real cash in about 45 minutes. That's a pretty good salary. I don't get paid that much, so I think that's a pretty good salary. Or you can give your own money. You have chosen not to help the poor victim, or you have chosen to help the poor victim and to give your own money. The perpetrator, now here's the thing, the perpetrator, if you give your own money, the perpetrator can detect you, and you can lose everything. The perpetrator sometimes doesn't detect, and with a lower probability detects, and you lose all of your money, and at the same time, they're wearing headphones, we pipe in maniacal laughter. No, we don't do that. We don't do that at all. No, that would be mean. But we do say that you've been detected. So now what do our people do? These are the exemplars. The other group, they basically stand pat, and they're basically observing this. The decision round number, basically what they're doing is they wind up really losing over 55% of their money, both in what they give freely and in perpetrator takings. We don't have a single time when our behavioral paradigm exemplar or putative exemplar stops giving on a subsequent session because they were detected on the previous session. And some of our people, 7 out of these 10 who were detected, actually continued giving and ended up with negative amounts that they had to then give up from their own earnings. And so it's quite remarkable. So I have some, because of time, I'm not going to go into the data, but there is very interesting neuroimaging data, and I want to just highlight this activation here in the insula and in the anterior cingulate. This is when they've been shown, these are our exemplars, when they've been shown that they have not chosen to help. There is this activation which is, has been previously associated, and so we don't really know what it's saying, but it's been previously associated with negative emotion here about oneself, disgust, etc., and cognitive conflict, perhaps about one's sense of self and what one should be doing rather than out of one's own identity rather than what one just did. Okay, so let's do some take-home here, and then we'll call it quits. So we have evidence for some evidence for stability of character, at least across 2 experimental paradigms with real-world consequences, losses and gains in terms of real money. Exemplars show increased emotional processing to increases in the numbers of group giving, and exemplars show increased attention to others' actions versus, and I didn't present this, but increased attention to others' actions versus their own reward in making these decisions, and exemplars show signs of self-conflict when not giving. And so finally, The social brain hypothesis, just to bring this all together, supports a view that sociality is really constitutive of human being. This is very, very helpful for pastoral ministry, it seems to me. Simulation theory supports a view of predispositions, but this is incomplete. And so we actually do need to pay attention to rich narrative, sometimes imaginative engagement with the other, and pastoral care is such engagement. And we also need to recognize that social neuroscience is interested in prayer practices to move us beyond what simulation theory gives us or equips us with. And then finally, there is evidence, at least some evidence, it's early days yet, for a stable, virtuous character, and it associates with, again, self-report, first-person reports, with taking risks, so behaviors taking risks to ease the suffering of others, as well as first-person reports with heightened awareness of the importance of benevolent love and of spirituality. Thank you very much, and be happy to answer any questions down here afterwards as we move into the break. Appreciate the time this morning.